The conversation that followed wasn't an easy one. There were moments of silence, moments when words failed and emotions ran deep. But it was real. And that was what made all the difference. Tessa, the woman biker, had taken the first step by reaching out, by asking for a conversation that went beyond the surface level. And now, as she looked around at the group of bikers sitting with her in that coffee shop, she could sense the weight of the decision they were about to make. It wasn't about abandoning their beliefs. It wasn't about throwing away the things that had defined them for so long. But it was about choosing a different path, a path where compassion and understanding weren't just afterthoughts, but guiding principles. The thick-bearded biker, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, broke the silence. You know, Tessa's right. We've been walking around like we have to fight for everything we believe in, like it's us against the world. But maybe it's time we ask ourselves if that fight is worth it. Maybe we've been fighting the wrong fight all along. Tessa nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I know we've all got our reasons for wearing what we wear, for standing for what we stand for. But if we keep doing it out of anger, out of fear, what are we really accomplishing? We're just adding to the noise, just adding to the division. That's not what we want. Not really. Another biker, a man with a deep voice and a rough exterior, leaned in. You're saying we should just let go of it all? Let go of the fight? I'm not saying we stop fighting for what we believe in, Tessa replied gently. But we have to fight smarter. We have to fight with empathy. We can't just hold on to our beliefs like shields, blocking out the rest of the world. We have to listen, we have to understand, and we have to find a way to build bridges instead of burning them. For a long moment, the room was quiet. The bikers exchanged glances, some uncertain, some deep in thought. The change wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could happen overnight. But they could feel it. They could feel the pull of something better, something more meaningful. It was as if the words had opened a door, and all they had to do now was walk through it. The quiet man with the thick beard spoke again. You know, I've been thinking about Shaq's words. About how people see us. I don't think we're as different as we thought. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real difference isn't in what we believe, but in how we treat each other in the process. Tessa's heart lifted. They were starting to get it. Exactly, she said. We may not always agree. We may never see eye to eye on everything. But if we can respect each other's humanity, if we can listen and understand, that's where the real change begins. As they sat down, Tessa felt something shift inside of her. This was the power of compassion. The simple act of opening up to others, of truly listening and understanding, could change the world around her. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward healing the divisions that had been tearing people apart for so long. Her friend watched her in silence, not knowing exactly what to say. It wasn't like Tessa to talk this way. She had always been the tough one, the one who didn't show vulnerability. But something in her had changed. Something in her had opened up, and it was clear she wasn't the same person who had walked into that diner a few days ago. I get it, he said quietly, his voice sincere. Maybe I've been so focused on defending myself that I haven't taken the time to understand where anyone else is coming from. Exactly, Tessa said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It's easy to get caught up in your own fight. But the real power, the real strength, comes when you can step back and see the bigger picture. And sometimes, that means letting go of the anger and the need to be right. It means allowing yourself to feel compassion. The man nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Maybe we all need a little more of that, compassion, I mean. It's easy to hate. It's easy to hold on to resentment. But it takes a lot more strength to open yourself up to others. Tessa looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. It's not easy. But it's worth it. Compassion isn't just about being nice. It's about truly understanding someone's pain, their struggle, their humanity. And once you do that, you realize that we're all in this together. We're all just trying to make it through the mess of life. As the conversation continued, Tessa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't a perfect solution. She wasn't going to suddenly fix everything in her life just because she'd had a conversation with Shaq. But she had learned something valuable, something she would carry with her from this day forward. Compassion wasn't just a feeling, it was an action. And that was something she could choose to practice, no matter who she was talking to. The next day, Tessa found herself walking into a local coffee shop where a few of the other bikers were gathered. They had all been in the diner that day, and though they hadn't spoken much after the encounter, the sense of change was palpable. They looked at her, some of them slightly guarded, others more open than usual. She walked up to the group, her usual confidence still intact, but there was something different about her now. "Hey," she greeted them, her tone softer than they were used to. "Can we talk?" One of the bikers, the man with the thick beard, looked at her and nodded. "Sure. What's up?" Tessa smiled, the conversation from the bar still fresh in her mind. "I think we need to have a conversation. Not just the usual small talk, but a real one. About what we learned, about where we're going from here." The group fell silent for a moment, surprised by the shift in Tessa's demeanor. But slowly, one by one, they began to nod in agreement. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to solve everything overnight. But they were willing to try. It had been several days since Shaq's encounter with the bikers, but the memory of that day lingered, like a quiet hum in the back of his mind. He had returned to his usual routine, but something had shifted in him. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation, how raw, how real it had been. The impact wasn't just on the bikers. It was on him, too. The experience reminded him of the power of compassion, something that, over the years, had sometimes felt lost in the noise of the world. Meanwhile, the bikers had gone their separate ways after leaving the diner, but the effect of their meeting with Shaq hadn't faded. Every one of them had felt it, the power of having their voices heard, of engaging in an honest, open conversation. The sense of understanding they had gained that day wasn't something that could be shaken off. It had sparked something deeper in each of them, and they found themselves reflecting on their words and actions more than they ever had before. One of the bikers, the woman who had spoken so thoughtfully about the power of seeing beyond the labels, sat at a local bar that evening, nursing a drink. The usual crowd was there, but tonight felt different. She wasn't just another biker, blending in with the tough crowd. She wasn't just the woman with the loud opinions anymore. She was more than that. She had learned that there was more to every person than the surface they showed. A man at the bar, someone she had known for years, leaned over and nudged her. "You all right, Tessa? You've been awfully quiet today." Tessa looked up at him, her expression softer than it had been in the past. "I'm thinking," she said simply. He raised an eyebrow. "Thinking? About what?" Tessa paused for a moment, considering her words carefully. "About a conversation I had a few days ago. With Shaq." Her friend let out a low whistle. "Shaq? What, like the basketball guy?" "Yeah," Tessa nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but it wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't some celebrity spectacle. It was real. It was human." The man seemed intrigued now, his previous skepticism replaced by curiosity. "What do you mean by that?" Tessa leaned back in her seat, thinking back to the conversation she'd had with Shaq. It was about seeing people for who they really are. Not just the labels we put on them. Not just the beliefs we think define them. Shaq said something that stuck with me, that sometimes the hardest thing is to just listen. Really listen. She took a deep breath, the weight of her own thoughts settling around her. "I've spent so much time pushing people away, assuming they didn't get me, assuming they didn't care about me. But maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's about me being willing to see them, too. But there was still a lingering question in the air. Could they take this new understanding and use it to bridge the gaps in the world around them? Could they challenge the status quo without resorting to division? The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, it felt like they were all on it together. "You think we can make a difference?" the young biker asked, his voice hopeful but unsure. The woman biker smiled, a small, quiet smile that held a world of meaning. "I don't know if we'll change the world overnight," she said. "But if we start with ourselves, if we start by seeing each other, not as enemies, but as human beings, we'll be on the right track." The other bikers nodded in agreement. It wasn't an easy road ahead. They knew there would be obstacles, and not everyone would be ready to listen. But they also knew that what had started in that diner was just the beginning, a seed that could grow into something far more significant. And so, the bikers decided to take action. They would continue to stand by what they believed in, but they would do so with a new sense of purpose. They would approach others not with anger or resentment, but with a willingness to listen and understand. They would challenge the status quo, not by shouting louder, but by leading with empathy and respect. As the group revved their engines and pulled out of the parking lot, Shaq was already on his way home, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of the day. But there was one thing that he was sure of: the bikers had begun to see each other, and the world, through a different lens. And that shift, however small, had the potential to ripple outward, changing the way people interacted and viewed each other, one conversation at a time. For Shaq, that was the victory. It wasn't about winning an argument or changing anyone's mind in an instant. It was about planting a seed of understanding, one that could grow into something far more powerful over time. The world outside hadn't changed yet, but for those involved in that moment, something had shifted. The question now was whether they would continue to listen, continue to understand, and continue to reach out across the divide. And if they did, they would learn that sometimes, the most unexpected moments, like a conversation between a group of bikers and a basketball legend, could change everything. As Shaq drove away from the diner, the quiet hum of his car was the only sound accompanying his thoughts. He felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, yes, but also a deep sense of curiosity. Had he truly made a difference, or had this just been a fleeting moment, something that would be forgotten the second the bikers rode off into the distance? Could the lessons learned in a single conversation last, or were they bound to dissolve as soon as they faced the challenges of the real world again? As he reflected on the encounter, he couldn't help but think back to the words of the younger biker, the one who had looked at him with wide eyes and admitted that maybe he had been fighting the wrong fight. That moment had stuck with Shaq because it spoke to a truth that transcended the world of politics, fame, and even sports. It was a truth that spoke to the heart of human connection, that sometimes, the most important thing we can do is simply listen, without judgment or preconceived notions. Meanwhile, the bikers weren't far behind. They had regrouped outside the diner, some of them leaning against their motorcycles, others pacing back and forth. The woman biker, who had been quiet throughout much of the conversation, now spoke up. "I didn't expect that," she admitted. "I thought it was going to be just another confrontation, another way to show everyone that we weren't backing down. But Shaq, he changed things. Didn't he?" One of the bikers nodded slowly, the once hard lines of his face softened. "He did," he said. "I thought I knew what I was fighting for. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe we've been so busy fighting for our side that we haven't taken the time to understand what others are going through." Another biker, the one with the thick beard, turned to the group. "You know, I've always been proud of who I am, of my beliefs. But I've never really asked myself why I hold on to them so tightly. Why do I let something like a hat define me so much? Maybe it's time to rethink that." The woman biker crossed her arms, her face thoughtful. "I'm starting to think it's not about the hat, or the politics, or even about being right. It's about whether we're willing to see each other for who we really are, beyond the labels. There was a pause as each biker took in her words. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about proving a point or defending a stance. It was about understanding. And the more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common, not just with Shaq, but with each other. They were all people trying to navigate a world that often felt like it was set against them. They had all faced judgment and misunderstanding, and they all longed for respect and connection. "You're right," the biker finally said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "I've always seen myself as someone who's supposed to fight for what I believe in, no matter what. But maybe I've been fighting the wrong fight." Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of encouragement. "It's never too late to start a new fight. A fight for understanding. A fight to change the way people see each other, not as enemies, but as people who just want the same thing: respect, dignity, and a chance to be heard." The biker looked at Shaq, his eyes filled with a new determination. "I think I get it now. I need to listen. I need to stop assuming that everyone is my enemy, just because they don't see things the way I do." The conversation was short, but it was profound. Shaq had given the young biker something to think about, and in doing so, had helped him see the world through a different lens. It wasn't about agreeing on everything. It was about the courage to engage, to open up, and to try and understand the humanity in others. As the biker stood up to leave, he paused for a moment, turning back to Shaq. "Thanks for this, man. For real. You've given me something I didn't expect to get today." Shaq grinned, his eyes filled with warmth. "No problem. It's not about agreeing, it's about learning to listen, and maybe, just maybe, finding some common ground." The biker nodded and walked away, his steps lighter than they had been when he first approached Shaq. Shaq watched him for a moment before turning back toward the diner. There, at the table, the other bikers had gathered again, and they seemed to be having a much different conversation than they had when they first arrived. Shaq's heart swelled with a quiet pride. This wasn't just about one conversation or one encounter. It was about starting something that could ripple outward, changing the way people saw each other, and perhaps even changing the world, one conversation at a time. As Shaq turned to leave the diner, he glanced back over his shoulder. The bikers were still there, talking, laughing now, an unspoken understanding between them. They were no longer just a group of angry men standing apart from the world. They were part of something bigger, a movement that started with a simple act of listening. Shaq knew the journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The real test would come in the days ahead, when the bikers and Shaq would face the challenges that awaited them in a world that was still deeply divided. But for now, he had done what he set out to do. He had made a difference. And that difference, however small it seemed in this moment, was enough. As the bikers disappeared down the road, their engines fading into the distance, Shaq stood there for a moment, reflecting. The sky above had turned a soft shade of orange, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, as if the world around him was slowly waking up to something new. A feeling of quiet satisfaction washed over him, but it was tempered with a deep thought that lingered in his mind. What had truly changed here today? Shaq had been in many situations throughout his life, facing loud debates, angry confrontations, and heated arguments. But today had been different. The encounter with the bikers wasn't about the fight or the disagreement, but about something more subtle. It had been about listening. And in that listening, something had begun to shift, not just in the bikers, but in him too. As he stood outside the diner, one of the younger bikers, the one with the thick beard, approached him. He had removed his leather jacket and seemed quieter now, his tough exterior replaced with something more reflective. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said in there," the biker began, his voice hesitant. "About listening. It's not something we do much of, you know? Especially not with people we don't agree with." Shaq nodded slowly, gesturing for the man to sit on the curb beside him. "Yeah, it's not easy. It's easy to stand by your beliefs when you feel like everyone else is against you. But if you really want to make a difference, sometimes the hardest thing is to stop talking and listen. The biker looked at the ground for a moment, as if weighing Shaq's words. I guess I've spent a lot of time fighting for what I believe in. But it feels like no one listens to me. Like I'm just one of the angry bikers people talk about behind our backs. Shaq sighed, his eyes staring out into the distance. I get that. It's easy to get caught up in that image. The tough guy. The one who doesn't care what others think. But what I've learned is that you can't change anything if you're not willing to have those uncomfortable conversations. The biker's eyes met Shaq's, a faint spark of realization flickering within them. And those conversations don't have to end in a fight, do they? Shaq smiled softly. Not at all. Sometimes, the hardest thing is just to understand where someone else is coming from. You don't have to agree with them, but you can see them. See their struggle. That's where change starts. There was a long pause, and for the first time, Shaq saw the biker's tough facade crack just a little. He wasn't just a man of anger and frustration anymore. He was a person, one who had been carrying the weight of a lifetime of assumptions and expectations. And now, he was beginning to realize that there was another way. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had been shared. What happens when we leave this diner? What happens when we go back out there, to a world that's still divided? Shaq sat back in his chair, thinking for a moment. The room had shifted from confrontation to conversation, from division to a sense of connection. But the world outside wasn't so forgiving. The tension that had initially sparked this meeting was still alive outside these walls, and the bikers knew it. Shaq knew it too. What happens next, Shaq said, his voice thoughtful, is up to you. And up to me. We can walk out of here and go right back to what we've always done, to the same habits, the same labels. Or we can take what we've learned today and try to make a difference. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be real. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what Shaq meant, but they couldn't deny the feeling that had settled in the room. Something had changed. The walls that had kept them apart were starting to crumble, and the possibility of change, of real change, felt almost tangible. But could they really walk away from this encounter and put it into action? Could they bridge the gap between their beliefs and Shaq's in a way that would matter beyond this diner? We'll see, said the man with the MAGA hat, a hint of a smile breaking through his tough exterior. I can't promise anything, Shaq. But you've got me thinking. And that's a start, right? Shaq smiled back, the warmth of the moment not lost on him. That's a start. And sometimes, that's all it takes. With that, the conversation slowed down. The bikers began to move away from the table, their demeanor now relaxed, as if the tension that had been so present earlier had melted away. They weren't friends yet, not in the way that people who truly understood each other were. But they had made a beginning, and that was more than they had come for. As the bikers made their way out of the diner, there was no cheering, no applause. There was simply a quiet acknowledgement of the change that had taken place, a shift that had happened not through force or shouting, but through understanding. In that moment, the bikers and Shaq shared something far greater than a political debate. They had shared a moment of humanity. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. The sound of motorcycle engines starting up filled the air once again, but this time, the rumble seemed different, less aggressive, more contemplative. Shaq stood by the door of the diner, watching as the bikers rode off into the distance. The world outside hadn't changed, not yet. But for a brief moment, something had shifted in the hearts of those who had been part of this encounter. And that was the real beginning of change. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the diner began to settle into something deeper, something more meaningful than anyone could have expected. The bikers, once so certain of their cause, now seemed to be searching for something they hadn't realized they needed. Shaq, too, was changing, not because he was trying to win anyone over, but because he was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. No one in the room had anticipated that this conversation would go beyond simple politics or disagreements. This was about understanding human experience. The conversation had gone from words to emotions. People who had been strangers, perhaps even enemies in some ways, were now sharing parts of their lives that they had never shared before. Shaq spoke about his upbringing, the pressure of growing up as an African American in a world that often saw him as a giant figure, rather than the man with hopes, dreams, and struggles just like anyone else. "I've always been this big," Shaq said, his deep voice filled with a quiet reflection. "And when you're big, people expect you to be something. They expect you to be strong, silent, maybe even untouchable. But what they don't see is the pressure. The expectation to always perform, to always be the big guy. It's a lot, and it's not always easy to carry that weight." The bikers listened, some nodding as they began to connect with the emotion behind his words. They too had felt that weight, though not the same one, not the same pressures, but they had faced their own. They were also expected to live up to a certain image, to conform to the expectations of the world around them. It was an unspoken bond that tied them together in this moment. One of the bikers, a quiet man who hadn't spoken much until now, finally spoke up. "I get that," he said, his voice low and steady. "I mean, I've had people look at me and just assume that I'm some angry guy, just because I'm a biker. They don't know that sometimes I wear this jacket because it makes me feel like I'm in control of something. Like I'm not invisible in a world that doesn't care about me." Shaq looked at him, his expression softening. "It's the same thing with me," he said. "People see me, but they don't always see what's beneath the surface. They think they know my story just by looking at me, but they don't." The room seemed to hold its breath, as the connection between Shaq and the bikers deepened. It was no longer about politics. It wasn't about the MAGA hat or any of the labels that had brought them here. It was about the shared experience of feeling misunderstood, of feeling like the world saw them in ways that didn't match the truth of who they were. Just as the room began to feel like it was on the brink of true understanding, an unexpected voice cut through the quiet. "So what now?" The voice came from the young biker, the one who had first spoken up. "It's hard to step out of that comfort zone, to have those tough conversations with people you don't agree with. But it's worth it." The woman biker nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when we pulled in here, I thought we were just gonna make a statement. Show everyone that we weren't afraid to speak our minds. But maybe we're not the only ones with something to say." "Exactly," Shaq replied, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Everyone has a voice. It's just about finding the right way to hear it." As the conversation continued, the bikers began to soften further. They shared more about their lives, about the struggles that had shaped their identities, and the reasons behind their beliefs. And for the first time, they listened as Shaq shared his own story, about growing up, about the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned along the way. But it wasn't just about swapping stories. It was about realizing that, despite their differences, they were more alike than they had thought. Both sides had faced struggles. Both sides had been misunderstood. And both sides had learned that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to open up and listen to someone who thought differently. The onlookers in the diner, who had been watching the conversation unfold, seemed to sense the shift as well. The tension that had once filled the air now felt like something more hopeful. People who had once been strangers, even adversaries, were now coming together through the simple act of sharing their experiences. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to complete. The bikers and Shaq had taken the first step, but the real test was still ahead. Could they take what they had learned in this moment and carry it forward into the world beyond this diner? Could they walk away from this conversation not just with a shared understanding, but with the courage to put that understanding into action? The room had gone from divided to united, if only for a moment. But it was a moment that would stay with everyone involved. It was a moment that had the potential to change everything. The minutes seemed to stretch on longer than usual, the silence settling over the group like a heavy blanket. The bikers, once brimming with boldness and defiance, now stood uncertain. Their tough exteriors hadn't cracked entirely, but there was a subtle shift in their demeanor, one that wasn't lost on anyone watching. Even the diner's staff, who had been watching the interaction from the sidelines, began to feel the weight of the conversation. Shaquille O'Neal, however, maintained his calm presence. His towering figure, usually associated with physical dominance, now exuded a quiet strength that came from a deeper place. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't fired back with accusations or defensive rhetoric. He had simply listened. And in doing so, he had invited the bikers to do something they rarely did: pause, reflect, and consider the other side. As the tension hung in the air, one of the younger bikers, a man with a thick beard and leather gloves, looked around at his friends. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I didn't expect this. I thought we'd come in here, make our point, and walk out. But I don't feel like that's happening now." The biker with the MAGA hat, who had been leading the confrontation, looked at his younger friend and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he admitted, "I thought we were gonna make some noise, force a reaction. But now, I don't know. I feel like we're actually talking." Shaq smiled slightly. "That's all it takes sometimes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't have to agree on everything. But we have to be willing to talk. Listen. Understand." It wasn't the kind of response the bikers had expected from a celebrity like Shaq. He wasn't delivering a soundbite or a carefully crafted statement. He wasn't playing the part of the famous basketball player. He was simply being a man trying to connect with other people, just as they were trying to do. His response was real, human, and genuine, and in that moment, it made a bigger impact than any argument could have. Another biker, a woman with a strong build and piercing eyes, spoke up. "I gotta admit, I've been so caught up in my own head about what I believe, I didn't even think about how it might sound to someone else. It's not always easy to hear, but you're right, Shaq. Sometimes we just need to listen." The group was starting to unravel the armor they had all built around their beliefs, layer by layer. The conversation was no longer a battle of wits or ideals, it had become something far more powerful. A moment of true connection, where both sides were acknowledging the humanity in each other. Shaq, sensing the shift, leaned forward slightly. "Look, I get it. I've been there. I've had people judge me for what I believe, for the choices I've made. But I've learned that it's easy to stay in your bubble, only listening to the people who think like you." Shaq listened carefully, not interrupting. He could see the passion in their eyes, the conviction in their words. But something told him there was more beneath the surface. Something deeper. And that's what he wanted to understand. "You know," Shaq said after a moment, "I've been in a lot of situations where people are quick to judge without knowing the whole story. But what I've learned is that sometimes, the only way to change someone's mind is to really listen, to understand where they're coming from. And it's not about agreeing with everything they say, but just seeing the humanity in each other." The biker who had spoken first let out a small laugh. "You sound like you've had a lot of practice with this." Shaq smiled slightly, but his expression was serious. "I've had my fair share of disagreements, but I've also learned that we don't have to fight every time we disagree. We can find a way to get along, even if it's just respecting each other's space and opinions." For a moment, the group of bikers was silent. The crowd in the diner, which had been whispering and exchanging nervous glances earlier, was now watching intently. Everyone could feel the shift in the conversation, the change in energy. The bikers, once so firm in their stance, were starting to consider something they hadn't before: maybe they didn't have to fight to be heard. Maybe there was another way. The man in the MAGA hat looked at Shaq for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not saying I agree with everything you just said, but maybe you're right. Maybe there's a way to have these conversations without it turning into a war." Shaq nodded. "That's what I'm talking about. A conversation. That's where change starts." The other bikers began to nod in agreement, their expressions softening. It wasn't a complete transformation, not yet. But there was a shift, a crack in the armor they had built around themselves. They weren't ready to let go of everything they believed in, but they were beginning to realize that there was more to understanding than just winning a fight. As the conversation continued, the walls between the two sides began to crumble. They still had differences, still had strong beliefs, but the hostility was fading. And for Shaq, that was a victory in itself. This wasn't just about politics or opinions. It was about bridging the gap between two worlds, two ways of thinking, and finding common ground where none seemed possible before. But little did they know, this was just the beginning. The real test would come later, when they had to decide whether or not they were truly ready to let go of the anger that had been fueling their beliefs for so long. Would they choose understanding, or would they retreat back into the walls they had built? The air in the diner had shifted. What was once a tense and potentially volatile situation was now teetering on the edge of something unexpected. The bikers, who had walked in full of determination, with the unspoken expectation that they would confront Shaq and challenge him, were now faced with something far more complicated than they anticipated. They had come to make their voices heard, to stand firm in their beliefs. But Shaq's calm, thoughtful response had caught them off guard. It wasn't what they expected from a man of his stature. The biker wearing the MAGA hat, still standing in front of Shaq, took a deep breath. His friends, now standing in a loose circle around the table, were silent, each one waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Shaq, on the other hand, was calm as ever, his eyes steady, not backing down but not raising his voice either. The man with the hat finally spoke again, this time softer, almost hesitant. "I wasn't expecting you to answer like that. I thought you'd just brush it off. But now I'm wondering, do you really get what this means? What it's about?" Shaq paused for a moment. He was no stranger to controversy, but this wasn't about defending a brand or a reputation. This was about something deeper. This was about trying to understand each other. Something he felt was missing in the world today. "I get that it means different things to different people," Shaq replied, his voice steady. "But what matters more than that is how we treat each other. And that's something I've always believed in. So maybe you can tell me why this hat matters so much to you." The biker looked at him for a moment, processing the question. Shaq wasn't just asking for an explanation, he was genuinely interested in hearing what motivated the man to wear the hat, to stand by it so firmly. It wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation to open up. Another biker, standing at the edge of the group, spoke up. "You really want to know?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "You really want to hear why we're so passionate about this? We're not just out here making a statement for the sake of it. This isn't some kind of joke." Shaq nodded. "I do. I want to understand." The biker paused for a moment, glancing at his friends before continuing. "It's about freedom, Shaq. It's about standing up for what we believe in, even if the world doesn't like it. We've been pushed around for years, told we don't matter, that we're the problem. And this hat is our way of saying we're not backing down." The words hung in the air. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It wasn't even just about politics. The bikers weren't just making a statement, they were fighting for a sense of identity, for something they felt they had lost in a world that was quick to label them, to judge them. They were standing up for themselves, for what they believed in, even if it meant standing apart from everyone else. "You know what this hat means, right?" the biker asked, pointing at the red MAGA hat. "It's not just a political statement. It's a way of life for some of us. And I gotta know, Shaq, do you stand for that? Or are you just here to sell a gimmick? The words hit like a punch. The question was direct, cutting through the air like a blade. Shaq paused, processing what was just said. He could feel the eyes of the room on him now. The bikers, the onlookers, everyone was waiting for his response. But Shaq wasn't just going to give a simple answer. He had to think this through. Stand for what? Shaq finally replied, leaning back in his chair, his calm demeanor unwavering. You think I'm here to sell anything? Or that this hat means what you think it means? The biker didn't back down. I'm asking if you believe in what this represents. You know the kind of division it causes, right? The tension it stirs up every time it's worn. You ready to deal with the fallout? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, but not in anger, more like a man considering how to approach a delicate subject. I'm not here to cause division. I'm here because I want to understand. I want to hear your side. You're not the only one with strong beliefs. The words caught the bikers off guard. They were expecting something more combative, a celebrity trying to defend his public image. Instead, Shaq was offering them an olive branch of sorts. A chance for dialogue. A chance to truly listen. For a moment, the bikers exchanged uncertain glances. It was as though they hadn't expected him to respond like this. The tension that had once felt heavy in the air began to shift. What was once an intimidating confrontation was now slowly becoming a conversation. A dialogue that could change everything. But would it? As Shaq sat there, looking each man in the eye, he realized something. This wasn't just about politics or hats. It was about something much deeper. Something that both sides could relate to, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. This moment could either escalate into a fight or transform into an opportunity for both sides to grow. What happened next would be the beginning of something unexpected. Something that no one, not the bikers, not Shaq, and certainly not the crowd gathered around, could have predicted. And it would all unfold from this single conversation, a conversation that had started with a challenge and might end in something far more powerful. It was a sunny afternoon, and the streets buzzed with the usual noise of traffic and people going about their day. Suddenly, a group of bikers rolled into the parking lot of a local diner, their powerful engines cutting through the air like thunder. The sound turned heads, and the crowd's eyes instinctively turned toward the tough-looking riders. Leather jackets, bandanas, and tattoos were the trademark of this group, known for their no-nonsense attitude. But today, they weren't here just to grab a meal or take a break from the road. No, today, they had a purpose. The bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement with authority. Among them was a man who seemed to stand out more than the others, wearing a MAGA hat that clearly caught the attention of those nearby. As the group entered the diner, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers passed between the patrons. Some smiled nervously, others exchanged glances. But there was one person, sitting at a table in the corner, who couldn't keep his eyes off the group. Shaquille O'Neal. The basketball legend, the towering figure everyone knew and admired, sat calmly with his coffee, seemingly unfazed by the sudden intrusion. But there was something about the biker's presence that seemed to pull at him. The hat. The boldness of it. It triggered a wave of curiosity and frustration inside him that he couldn't ignore. As the bikers walked past his table, a quiet tension lingered in the air. Shaq watched them, studying the expressions on their faces. He had heard all the rumors about these types of groups, people who wore their beliefs like armor, determined to stand by them no matter the cost. But this wasn't just another group of bikers. There was something different about this encounter. The man wearing the MAGA hat noticed Shaq staring, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Something shifted. It was as if the unspoken tension between them crackled in the air, the kind of moment that made people hold their breath. Then, without warning, the man walked up to Shaq's table, his boots clicking sharply against the diner's tile floor. The entire room seemed to pause. Conversations slowed. Eyes darted from the bikers to Shaq and back. "Hey, Shaq," the man said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to talk." Shaq, taken aback, raised an eyebrow. He had been expecting a scene of some kind, but not this direct. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone calm, even though the air felt thick with tension. The bikers' friends gathered around, forming a loose circle. Some looked curious, others tense. The atmosphere became heavier, charged with the sense that this conversation was about to take a turn no one saw coming. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the clinking of glasses and the occasional murmur from the onlookers. The group was starting to shift. The once hard, immovable walls between them and the world outside were beginning to crumble. It wasn't about agreeing on every issue. She stood up and looked at each of them. "Let's do this. Let's start building something better." The bikers stood with her, their faces reflecting a shared determination. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something that could spread beyond their group, beyond their town, and into the world. They walked out of the coffee shop, not as bikers or as a group of strangers, but as individuals who had chosen a path of understanding. And as they stepped into the world outside, something had shifted, not just within them, but within the world around them. The walls they had built up were beginning to come down. The conversation wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The sun was beginning to set as the bikers revved their engines and rode down the highway, the wind rushing against their faces. There was a quiet sense of change in the air, something palpable that had begun to stir in the hearts of each of them. As they rode side by side, there was no longer that edge of tension, that sense of division that had once been so heavy between them. Instead, there was an understanding. A shared feeling that they were no longer isolated in their beliefs. They had started something new, and the journey ahead, while uncertain, was no longer one they had to face alone. The road ahead stretched out before them, winding and long. They were no longer just a group of bikers on the road. They were people who had made a decision to listen, to understand, and to choose compassion over division. It wasn't going to be easy, they knew that. The world outside was still full of challenges, still full of the noise and the arguments. But they had learned something valuable. The real power didn't come from proving a point. It came from finding common ground. From realizing that no matter how different their worlds might seem, they were all human. They all shared the same struggles, the same hopes, the same desire to be heard. Tessa, the woman who had led the charge in reaching out to Shaq, felt a calm settle in her chest as she rode. She looked at the others, each of them lost in their thoughts, but somehow, they were all connected. There was a unity in the silence, a quiet understanding that this moment would stay with them forever. Shaquille O'Neal had been right, she realized. The conversation had been more than just an exchange of words. It had been a turning point, a reminder that people could change, not just through grand gestures, but through small, meaningful moments of connection. The real change came from within, from the willingness to listen and the courage to understand. It wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't instant, but it was the beginning of something profound. Back at the diner, the world seemed unchanged. The same people, the same noise, the same uncertainty. But for those who had been part of that moment, the bikers and Shaq alike, the world had shifted. It wasn't just about politics or beliefs anymore. It was about human connection. About respecting the fact that everyone had a story, everyone had a struggle, and everyone deserved to be seen for who they truly were. As they rode, Tessa thought about the future. She knew there would be times when it would be hard. Times when the temptation to fall back into old habits, old patterns of judgment and anger, would try to take over. But she also knew that they had something stronger now, a shared understanding, a new way of seeing the world. And that was something no one could take from them. In the days that followed, the bikers began to see the world differently. They still wore their leather jackets, still had the same tough exteriors, but they no longer saw the people around them as enemies. That real change begins with understanding. That real power comes not from division, but from unity. And that every moment, no matter how small, could be the beginning of something extraordinary. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Shaq smiled softly to himself, knowing that this moment, this simple conversation, had planted a seed that would continue to grow in the hearts of those who had been part of it. The road ahead was long, but the path had already been set. And with each step, each conversation, they would continue to walk it together.